Welcome to another episode of Book Swap. I'm Chris, the teen librarian here at Acton Memorial Library, and with me this month is Kerri, our assistant director. And I had her, as always, read one of our YA books, and she had me read a book from the genre of her choice, and we're excited to talk to you about it today. So this month I had you read, I know you like historical fiction and more than contemporary, so I had you read One for All, which is a Three Musketeers retelling. It's a little bit gender bent, well, not really a retelling, but in that same vein. So just to start off, I know you like to read nonfiction history, but you did read a lot of YA as a former teen librarian yourself.
I did.
So I'm curious to hear how you felt about One for All, specifically as part of the genre sphere of YA.
I found it interesting. There were a lot of themes throughout. And I think the thing that I appreciated the most about it was the friendships among the four women, four young women who are working together to kind of solve the mystery of attempted assassination of the King of France.
Yes.
So I appreciated that. I thought there was a lot going on in the book. And sometimes it was hard for me to suspend my disbelief on certain things.
Sure.
But overall,
yes.
I found it a solid. I think it's a debut author, Lillie Lainoff.
Yes.
So I found it a solid first book.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, speaking of the friendships, I mean, the underlying theme of basically any Musketeer story out there is the strong friendships between the Musketeers themselves. And that's absolutely, as you said, felt here as well with the four girls, the four Musketeers. And I'm curious if you felt like that particular brand of friendship in this Musketeer story hit you any differently than other, I mean, that's obviously not an uncommon trope in YA, right?
No.
But if any aspect of it really hit you in a different way or felt different than what we see in other YA stories.
I think I can only remember one minor conflict between the girls.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the thing that I appreciated the most about the friendships is that they were so supportive. I think the main character comes in feeling like very unsure of her footing within the group.
Right.
And keeps expecting them to turn on her.
Right.
And so to have that not really happen throughout, even when there is conflict, it's resolved very quickly. It doesn't linger.
Right.
And so it just, for me, I think that was the thing I appreciated the most, is how solid. I think oftentimes we see women depicted as competitors.
Yeah.
And that wasn't the case here. They were all sort of like uplifting each other, and they felt that the success of each other was important to the success of the whole.
Yes.
And so I really appreciated that.
Right.
I think the most.
Right. And as we get, there's so many new authors coming into the YA space. As you know, there's a lot of turnover in YA books. There's constantly new YA books coming out all the time. And that is one thing that I've noticed, is a lot of the toxicity in female relationships and the toxicity in romantic relationships seems to be reducing the toxicity of family relationships even. I know this book is not a good example, but you and I have talked a lot about how YA books are pretty much always a dead parent book.
Yes.
Spoiler alert, there is a passed away parent in this book, so this is not the perfect example of that.
Yes. And an absentee mother.
And yes.
Yeah.
So,
emotionally and physically for part of the book. So
she's reducing toxicity in other places. It's fine. But I do generally see that trend happening in YA where authors are feeling more empowerment to make the conflict an actual outside source, as opposed to horrendous relationships that the main character just deals with for some reason.
Yeah.
So that's a nice thing. So the main character in One for All, Tanya, she has POTS, which I have to read this because otherwise I'm not going to pronounce it correctly. So POTS stands for postural, or I can't even say it when I'm reading it, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. And a huge part of the book, we talked about that there's a lot going on, there's a lot of themes and things, but a huge part of the book is her learning how to fight for her own accessibility, learning what she needs for her own accessibility, because this is obviously historical fiction. It takes place in the 1600s when nobody knew what POTS was. She didn't have a diagnosis. Nobody knew how to treat it. Which sort of brings me to my question, because a lot of the disability representation that exists in YA exists in contemporary fiction. It exists in present day, where the disease is known. The treatment might take a second to get there, but that's not the barrier. The barrier isn't figuring out how to be accessible. The barrier is getting everybody else to be accessible for you. And she has to deal with both. And I'm curious how you felt the representation changed or was different, and how teens will interact with it differently in this context as opposed to a contemporary fiction context.
I think that some of the things that I took away from the depiction is that I had a really hard time. This is where the suspension of disbelief came in, how quickly her turnaround was once getting to the school and starting her intensive training, especially when, like you said, no one had any idea what this disease was. No one had any idea how to treat this disease.
Right.
And so for her, going from a situation back in her village where she struggled to kind of even walk without fainting, she couldn't do stairs, she couldn't get up too suddenly, and to see all of those things now, all of a sudden she's dancing at balls, she's, you know, chasing after the quote unquote villains in the book, even though she doesn't always know some of them are villains. So I think for me that was the sort of the hard part. But I did like, I think one of the things, there's a scene where they know that she can't do stairs, so they build like a lift for her. And finding that, and also how supportive the other girls are, like when they see that she's starting to struggle, kind of swooping in to kind of redirect her to where she can sit down, catch her breath. But I thought that they could have delved deeper into that neighborhood in Paris where you find a lot of the poor and the infirm, and you know, it was mentioned throughout, but when they talk about really uplifting the Parisians, that was sort of glossed over. And I would have liked to have seen some more development and some more interaction with the people in that area, because I felt like it wasn't a whole well-rounded depiction. It focused primarily, and I know the author struggles with POTS as well, and so she's speaking from a first-hand experience, which I love. I really don't appreciate when people try to write and depict.
Absolutely not.
Just because I feel like it lacks in authenticity oftentimes. I mean, you can do all the research in the world, but if you don't have that first-hand experience, it's really, really hard to get an accurate sense of what it feels like to be in that position and what it feels like to have to struggle for those things. So I appreciated that also it was a disability that not really many people know about. I mean, I'd heard about POTS before, but I knew very, like, next to nothing about it. So yeah.
I definitely agree with you. She does recover very quickly, which I understand. And reading interviews with the author, a lot of that comes from her own desire, as both a child and a woman, to not let anything stop her. So I 100% understand what you're coming from, and I understand why she wrote it that way. One thing that I do like about it is that I think it's much more likely with this cover, which I understand this girl is supposed to look like the author, but she looks like Helena Bonham Carter to me.
She does, yes.
That's how I describe it when I can't remember what it's called. I'm like, it's Helena Bonham Carter as a musketeer. So Lillie Lainoff, if you see this, you look like Helena Bonham Carter. It's a compliment, I promise. But kids who don't necessarily, kids who aren't seeking out books with characters who have POTS in it are going to potentially see this book and see it as a fun adventure. Which I like, because that makes them more likely to pick it up. Because disability representation is so important, not just for the kids who have the disability, because it's important for them to see themselves on the page, but it's also important, I feel like, for the teens who don't have that disability, so that they can build empathy and understanding, because their little brains are still figuring all that out. That's why they read.
Yes.
That's why they seek this stuff out. That's why, unfortunately, a lot of their parents are dead.
Yeah.
So
Well,
the characters' parents, not the teens' parents.
I will say that I loved the relationship between her and her father before.
Yes.
Spoiler alert, he's the parent who passes away.
Yes.
But I love the relationship that they had together, and how encouraging he was, and how, the mother worried so much about how she would take care of herself and what her future would look like, because she felt like she would never find a husband. And the father, was there as the presence that was like, she doesn't need a husband.
Yeah.
She can take care of herself.
Yeah.
She'll be okay. And he makes arrangements to get her into this school, which is, basically a spy academy that no one knows about, is
right.
With the cover of an etiquette,
which is very fun.
And charm school. Yes.
Very fun. I also love, she spends a lot of the book dealing with her grief by finding ways to make it feel like her father's still with her through the fencing and through the adventure itself, because he was a musketeer, and through just fighting for people the way that she felt like he always did. So it was really, really a beautiful allegory not an allegory, but it was a beautiful display of grief, and moving through that. So that was really touching. Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. The mother was a little frustrating, but I understood it for the time period it was.
Yes.
Where so often a woman was an extension of her husband.
Yes.
And so her worrying about what her life would look like without a husband, and how anyone would look past her disability. I understood that, but I felt like there could have been a lot more empathy in how she engaged with her daughter.
And it's interesting. I have this conversation all the time about how women act in historical fiction. And I often have to have the conversation, usually with my brother, about the difference between historical fiction and contemporary fiction that's old, like Jane Austen.
Yeah.
Because he will get frustrated about how the women are acting in Jane Austen and the Bronte sisters and whatever. And I'm like, that's not historical fiction. That's not told from a modern day lens. But it is interesting how much more frustrating it can be when women in historical fiction act a certain way, because it is told from a modern day lens. But the author is obviously living in the modern day, but telling a story set in the 1600s. So it does feel a little bit more frustrating, definitely, when you're reading historical fiction, and that crops up. Yeah, for sure. You just kind of want to shake them. Like,
you do.
Stop it. Well, speaking of wanting to shake people, and women, The Small and the Mighty is by Sharon McMahon. This is the book that Kerri had me read this month. It was very good. I will tell you, I hardly ever read nonfiction, partially because I read a lot of YA fiction and graphic novels for work, and partially because that's what I like.
And I'm the opposite.
So it works out. If you want to be a librarian, I recommend being a librarian for the age group that you like to read the books. It'll make your job a lot easier.
That is very true.
But this book focused on several stories of small people throughout history who weren't, the big names that are necessarily going down in history books, unless it's this one. But who had a really meaningful impact on American society and the societies in which they lived. I did really enjoy it. It was very sweet, but I'll let you ask your questions. Do you want your thing back?
I do, yes. All right. So I want to know, which of the people covered did you find the most inspiring, and why?
So I really loved Virginia Randolph for a couple of different reasons. One, her story took place in Virginia, which is where I grew up, and I was familiar with the Virginia Randolph School in Henrico County. I have family members who went there, or so I've driven past it, and I never knew her story. So it was really, really cool to get to hear her story and know where that came from. But it also, and Sharon McMahon felt like was lecturing me through the book.
There's a bit of it.
Yes. But there was, because this woman, she just wanted to help so much, and she unfortunately made the poor decision, for modern day sensibilities, of using all of her lifetime savings to improve the school and buy land for the school that she then gave for free to the state of Virginia, and they let her do it. And that, it was a repeat over and over and over again. The school burned down, and she spent all of her life savings trying to get it back, and then bequeath it to the state again. And it was gorgeous, and it was beautiful, and I loved her story so much. But it also hit very close to home, because you are very well aware sometimes with budget constraints and things, and you want to do things for your kids that are just like, okay, but you can't pay for this out of your pocket. Don't do it. Don't do it. But the urge is so strong. And it just, it kind of felt like, never to the, she spent the equivalent of millions of dollars, basically, in today's money to buy that land. But, you're like, oh, I can't get this for my kids, and they really want it. And the urge to just do it is so strong. And so this was a great reminder that you can be there for your kids, and you can do your best without crippling yourself, and without letting a system take over and what's the word I want?
I don't know.
Not manipulate, but take advantage. I guess that wasn't the word, but it's close enough. Take advantage of your caringness and your heart in order to get what they want without having to do anything for it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think the hard part about Virginia's story is that, she herself, had to fight for education, for her own schooling.
Yeah.
And, they didn't teach financial planning. And there were so many people who were willing to take advantage of her.
Yes.
But I think the thing that I loved the most is that she was always focused on the next needed thing.
Yes, I did love that. Not worrying about the future so much, and just focusing on what you can do right now. That's definitely something I struggle with. I have pretty severe anxiety, and the way that I manage it is through planning. It's like, if this happens, if the worst possible thing happens, this is what I'll do. Yeah. This is the steps that I'll take. And that's sort of what I focus on to, pull myself out of a panic attack, basically. Yeah. But it's so hard then in the moment to say, okay, well, you can do this thing right now. And, her strength and her resilience were absolutely phenomenal. Phenomenal to see. So I loved her story, and I loved getting to know more about that piece of history that I'd driven by so many times, but I had never known the answer about why that school was called that.
That's great.
Yeah.
I think that theme of resilience is so consistent throughout all the stories told. I loved the story of Clara.
Yes.
Who was, a freed slave who fought for her freedom, who spent her life trying to reunite with her daughter who had been sold to someone else. But even in the midst of all of that, never stopped fighting for the betterment of her community. Yeah. Even when her community didn't appreciate her or didn't want her around, she still worked to better, and seeing how, Colorado honored her. Yeah. Many years after she had passed, but still she stands as a testament to the resilience of humanity. I think
Yeah.
it exists in all of us. And I think
Mhm.
sometimes in the messiness of life and the struggle of life, we can forget that
Yeah.
spirit does reside in every single one of us. And I appreciated so much that all of these stories, I mean, some focused on people who were much more well off in society.
Right.
But I think by far most of the stories that were told were everyday people
Yeah.
who, you know, had a goal and worked towards it and didn't let what most of us would get in the way, you know, what most of us would be like, well, common sense would dictate that.
Yeah. We don't walk across the plains
Yeah.
on foot at 65
Yeah.
by ourselves.
Yes. When our vision is going.
Yeah. Carrying a steel oven on our heads.
Yes. You know, but I think for so many of the stories that were told, you see that theme throughout.
Yeah.
You know, whether it was the women who were fighting for the suffragist movement, whether it was the women who were fighting for the civil rights, even in Governor Morrison's story, which is the story that opens, seeing the hope that he has for this country and for justice.
Right.
Even though he made really terrible decisions,
terrible
like the
choices,
whalebone.
Yeah.
You know,
the story of how he died is crazy.
Yeah. But we don't want to give too much away.
No. Just to read the first 20 pages of the book. No.
Yes. But seeing that and seeing, you know, the hope and love that he had for this idea of what America could be, and how he didn't let, you know, what he saw, because he was good friends with Alexander Hamilton. He was in the room when he died, and he didn't let that stop him from, you know, his missions in life.
Yeah.
So my next question for you, and you had mentioned this already, but what did you think about the author's interjections and commentary? Did you enjoy hearing her point of view, or did you prefer when nonfiction narratives stand on their own?
Yes, I very much enjoyed it. I think generally the times that I have read nonfiction and enjoyed it, it has been with that personality of the author inserted, which I really like it. And I think it adds, it makes it feel more like a story, because they are stories.
Yeah.
They're an oral, not oral, but, you know, it gives that feeling of the oral history of like, okay, she's sitting in front of us and she's telling us the story. And she's providing references, you know, she has references to everything in the back, but her injecting her voice makes it feel more like, you know, I'm sitting listening to a story and this is great. And the fact that it's real, that it's true, just lends it that much more enjoyment. But it's hard for me to find that without the author's voice a lot of times, when it's just kind of like a textbook. You know, it's a little bit harder.
Yeah.
So I did really, really enjoy her interjections. I thought they were great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the thing that I love the most is that this is an author that I found on social media. She has a pretty large platform where she dedicates her time and energy into educating America about government and history. She was a former teacher. She feels very, very passionate about both of those topics. And so you see that sort of throughout when she's talking about the different people and throughout history. And I think that sometimes it can get a little preachy.
Yeah.
But I think it comes from a place of like, not just wanting to share stories, but to uplift people. And I think so often, especially, I would say in the last couple of decades, I feel like with the way media has gone and so the sort of advent of social media and the coming of social media, we often kind of are inundated with, you know, the bad news.
Sure.
And it can feel oftentimes that we're powerless to make any sort of meaningful contribution.
Yeah.
Or affect any change of substance. And I think what this book kind of did for me was highlight how impactful we can be in our individual communities. And I think that was sort of really the goal and intent, to kind of impress upon each of us that we all have the power to uplift, to affect positive change. But yeah, I think that voice was pretty strong throughout. And I loved kind of when she's ruminating on what a conversation might have looked like.
Yeah.
You know, she does have all of these sources that she cites throughout, but when she gets down into like, I imagine them saying this, or
yeah.
I could see this conversation playing out that way. And I think it does sort of lend a sense of like you're in the room.
Yeah, absolutely.
When it's happening.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, all right. So my next question,
yep.
following on that theme, do you agree with McMahon that hope is a choice and not a feeling? And what does it mean to choose hope, and how can we do so in our day-to-day lives?
I absolutely think choosing hope is, and this book is so, I don't know that she intended it this way, but it's so appropriately timed for our current political climate. And I absolutely think hope is a choice. And in some cases, you can't let it just be. One of my favorite people of all time, Brennan Lee Mulligan. Hope you nerds know who that is. But he recently said in an interview that now is not the time for depression and despair. Now is the time for action, which I think is the same kind of sentiment, because you can't motivate yourself to take action if you don't have the hope.
Yeah.
So you have to choose to have that hope in order to move forward. There does become a little bit of a struggle, because obviously, I mean, we're relatively well-off white women, so there's a certain level of choice that gives us that is not available to people who are in minority groups. They don't have the choice to just give up because it's their lives. So that's where I think that the fact that it's a choice is different for different groups. But I do think that definitely it's a choice to keep fighting, and you have to find that somehow, whether it's hope, whether it's anger, whether it's whatever you need to motivate yourself. But I think hope has a longer staying power. Anger tends to exhaust you faster.
Yes.
So I think hope is the better choice to use to motivate yourself. But if you can't find it, then use whatever tools you got.
Yeah.
Because you just got to keep fighting.
Yeah.
And that's such a powerful message. It can be very hard, when you see all of these things happening, and there's an overload almost. You don't know what to fight for in that moment because there's so many things.
Yeah.
So not letting that overwhelm you, and picking your thing, and fighting for it as best you can is so important.
Yeah, and I think that so many of these stories, they focused on such a small community level.
Yeah.
Even knowing it would have greater ripple effects. Like I think of like Claudette's story, and she refused to get up and give up her seat, and was part of the lawsuit that eventually dismantled the segregation in Mississippi. Montgomery.
Yeah.
That's right. It was the Montgomery bus
Yeah.
Boycott. So she focused on her circumstances in that moment, knowing that the ripple effect of that would be far surpass that.
Right.
And you can see other historical figures throughout, like Rosa Parks, obviously was the person that we often think of when we think of who gave up their seat. But Claudette came before Rosa.
Yeah.
And Claudette had circumstances that were very different from Rosa. She was a teenager.
Right.
She was unwed. She was a single mom. And she still never let it stop her from doing what she felt was right, and sort of focusing on those things. And I think that for me, what I took from it was that, I have the ability to affect my own community. And sometimes when we affect our own community, the impact of that goes far beyond.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't have to be in Inez traveling the country for the suffrage movement, and working myself until I, am so sick and infirm I can't get out of bed.
Sure.
But I can start small,
Yeah.
and I can work in my community, and I can see where the need is, and I can, work towards what is just and what is right. And I think that was the big takeaway for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, that's a very hopeful note
Yes.
to end on. So we're going to wrap it up here. Please, if you've read these books or if you'd like to read these books, you can get them here, and let us know in the comments what you thought about them. And we'd be happy to hear from you, and we will see you next time. Bye, guys.